Hey guys, welcome to the Saltwater Dreamscapes studio. We are here for our very first art tutorial. We're going to be painting an octopus today. I'm Amber Angeloni. I am the artist at Saltwater Dreamscapes, and I do a lot of wildlife painting on reclaimed wood, particularly reclaimed cypress. And I'm going to put my website down in the description, so if you'd like to check out my work, you can. And you can also see some of it in the background here. So today we're going to be painting an octopus. This is kind of what we're going to end up with, although we're going to stick with the neutral background today. But these are about the right colors that we're going to be using. And I'm going to tell you first what supplies you need. Again, don't worry if you don't catch everything the first time. I'm going to put everything in the description as well as some substitutions you can use in case you don't have the exact brands or colors that I'm telling you. So the first thing you're going to need is your painting surface, and I'm going to be using this piece of Florida cypress, which I've scorched around the edge. If you've got a piece of wood, great. If not, you can use a piece of canvas, you can use a thick illustration board or a thick paper. Possibilities are endless. Whatever you got handy is fine. You're also going to need a palette to put your paint on. I use a plastic palette and I wrap it with wax paper for easy disposal. You can also use a paper plate, Tupperware lid, whatever you got handy is fine. You're going to need a cup of water for rinsing your brushes and a paper towel or a towel for drying them. And we're using 3 brushes today. I play it pretty fast and loose with my paint brushes. I don't always have or use the same ones, but I like filberts. You could also use a flat if you like. This one is an 8. I don't have a brand preference. These two are both rounds. One is a 0 and one is a 1. And again, if you've got something kind of close, just use that. That's fine. As far as paint goes, I use Grumbacher, which is a pretty good mid-range brand. Any brand that you have is fine, but if you want these exact colors, that's what I'm using. I'm going to use a titanium white, first of all, a cadmium yellow medium, and again, if you don't have medium, that's fine. Any kind of cad yellow will work. This is a color that I love from Grumbacher called turquoise green. I use it all the time and I buy tons and tons of it. If you don't have it, that's fine. You can make something similar by mixing a little phthalo blue with a little cadmium yellow and some white, and you'll get a similar effect. We're also going to be using dioxazine purple. And finally, you're going to need some kind of magenta. This is a brand that I love called Matisse, and this is their Quin Violet. That's the one that I love. It's a beautiful fuchsia color. It's very vibrant. If you don't have that, any Quin Violet, Quin Magenta will be fine. And you could also use alizarin crimson. You would get a slightly different effect with that. It'd be a little bit more muted, not quite as bright, but that's perfectly fine as well. So that's what you need to get started. We are about to begin, so here we go. Okay, so we're ready to get started. We're going to do this in 4 steps. So first thing we're going to do is draw our outline. After that, we will do a rough shading in. We're going to put in the colors that we're going to use in our light and dark areas. Then we will put a second layer on, and then finally, our 4th step, we're going to add some details. So the only thing that you're going to need right now is that dioxazine purple. You're just going to need a little bit, and your medium round brush. Mine is a size 1. If you are working on a piece of wood like I am, I would recommend that you sand it. I sand mine to 320. Even if I buy something like from a craft store like Michael's, I find that it's usually not well sanded, and so if you just hit it with the 320 before you get started, it'll save you a lot of hassle. Also, if you want to draw your outline in pencil, that's perfectly fine too. A lot of people prefer to do it that way. I like to use paint because I find that it's easier to cover up than pencil lines, and I've painted a bunch of octopuses, and the great thing about them is that they don't have to be perfect because their arms do all kinds of crazy things. So I'm not going to worry about drawing it in with a pencil. I'm just going to go straight to paint. But you do whatever you're comfortable with. And before we get started, we're just going to take a little bit of our purple paint and sort of mush it a little bit on our palette. And then what I do to make sure that my brush is loaded with a thin layer of paint instead of a globby amount like it is right now is I'll take my brush and just kind of twirl it on the palette, and that sort of gets rid of all of the excess so that you get a nice thin line. You can also add a little bit of water to your acrylic if you find that it's starting to get too thick or it's not spreading properly, but you don't want to add too much because you can break down the binding and the paint, and then you'll have things like cracking in your final product, so we don't want that. So we are going to start with the eye of the octopus, and it's just going to be a circle. With a smaller circle inside of it, just like that. Okay, and we're going to do a little swoopy line. And do the back of his head. I apologize in advance to any marine biologists who are watching this tutorial because I am going to be using all kinds of terminology that's not correct, I'm 100% sure. You guys can leave me a message down in the comments and let me know where I messed it up. They also have this gill right behind the eye. I think of it as an ear. It's absolutely not. I do understand that. But when it comes to like the placement of it and the shape, that's how I think of it. So we're just going to do that little backwards C and then connect it, the blobby part. It's a technical term. I also love this particular kind of octopus that we're doing because they have these lumpy crests on the backs of their heads and also one right at the top of their eye. It looks like a horn. Again, it's not, but all right. As I'm sure you know, the octopus has 8 arms, and I will count them a bunch of times while I am doing this because I always think that I'm probably going to end up with like a 9-armed octopus. I just get carried away. So we're going to make another swoopy line. We're going to come down from the eye and sort of taper out like that. And we'll make another one here. The great thing about painting the octopus is that their arms can go any direction. And so no matter what kind of painting surface you have, you can usually make an octopus work. Their tentacles are usually about the same length, but they can stretch them a bit, so I don't worry about getting it exact. And you want to make them taper as they come toward the body, so they're wider at the base. All right, they have this webbing. It almost kind of looks like a skirt connecting their tentacles, so we're going to do that, and then I'm going to make this arm loop. Go down that way. We're going to make this tentacle kind of look like it's coming out at us. So we'll see all of the suckers on this one. See how I've kind of run out of room over here? That's perfectly fine. We're just going to make this arm curve back around like that. Do one more. All right, so that's 6. I'm going to make one come out from the back. Then we'll make one come down. This way. All right. The last thing we're going to add is they have this tubular structure here that comes out near that gill. So our outline is done. We're going to let that set up for a few minutes and then we will come back. Okay, so we've given this a few minutes to kind of set. The nice thing about acrylics is it doesn't take it a real long time to get dry enough to move on to the next step. But I would let it sit for, I don't know, 10-15 minutes at this stage. And then after this step, we're going to let it sit for at least 20 minutes, up to an hour. Basically, you just want it dry enough that you can touch it and you don't get any acrylic paint on your hand. So we're going to put the rest of our colors on our palette now. If it's been a long time since you stepped away, you might need more purple. Got my magenta here. And you'll notice that I'm going both in order from darkest to lightest color and also sort of roughly on par with the color wheel. And the reason for that is that it just keeps the palette nice and organized. I'm going to get my titanium white. So what we're going to do next is just going to be sort of a roughing in of our lights and darks, and also what colors we're going to use in what areas. So I always work from dark to light, and that tends to be the rule of thumb for acrylics painters. You can do it however you're comfortable, but this is what works for me. So we're using that number 8 filbert brush or a flat of similar size. You really just want a brush that's going to be big enough that you can get good coverage with it. And we're going to start putting in our darks by filling in that gill right there, that opening. And then the bottom of the mantle here. So generally, unless something funky is going on with your light source, you're going to have lights at the top and darks at the bottom. And as I mentioned, the octopus kind of has almost like it looks like a skirt with this webbing between the arms. So there's a dark area in between each of the arms. Also, these two arms that are coming from the back are going to be darker than the ones that are in the front. You'll notice that when I am filling in large areas, I hold my brush flat like this. And when I'm filling in smaller areas, I turn it on its side like this. You could also switch to a different brush. It just saves time this way. We're not going to rinse our brush now. As we go to our next lightest shade, we're just going to get some magenta, mix a little bit of our purple into it, and then also mix, more than that, a little bit of our white. We're not super concerned about things like brush strokes right now because we're going to cover most of this up in our next step. Acrylic tends to be a little bit thin, and so I typically do several layers, and I find that that's the easiest way to make sure that you're getting good coverage. Alright, so we put in a little bit of our lighter purple on the base of the mantle. We've put some on each arm. I'll put just a little bit there as well. Alright, so now we are going to rinse our brush. The reason we're going to rinse our brush now is because we're about to add some yellow. And yellow and purple, when mixed together, do not make a pretty color. So anytime you rinse your brush, you want to go ahead and dry it on your paper towel or whatever you've got handy. The reason is we don't want to mix the water into the paint. It'll thin it too much and make it look more like watercolor. And also, as I mentioned, it can break down the binding in the paint, so we don't want that. We're going to get a little bit of our yellow and a little bit of our magenta and mix those together, being careful not to get any of the purple that we've kind of left some residue on the magenta there. And I'm going to make basically two colors, a more yellow version and a more magenta version. So first we're going to take the magenta and fill in the areas that we haven't filled in yet, and then we'll put that more yellow version on the very top. I'm going to add a little bit more white, a little bit more magenta, and then fill in this tentacle that's coming out at us. And then I'm going to get my medium-sized round brush for the eye. Because it is a smaller space, I'm not going to be able to fit that filbert brush in there. We're just going to go around and then I'm just going to add one last highlight. Like that. Alright, so that's the end of step 2. We're going to let this sit for at least 20 minutes up to an hour until you can lay your hand on the paint and it comes away completely dry. Okay, so it's been about 20 minutes. As you can see, I can pat my painting and it's dry. So we're going to do another coat essentially the same way that we just did. And the reason is you can see that the paint is kind of thin. You can still see the wood. You can see some streaks. So we want to get rid of that. Check your paint before you get started. You may need more. One of the reasons I just use a tiny blob is so that it doesn't dry out on the palette. I can just add more if I need to. So we're just going to go back over our darkest darks with our straight purple. And, mix a little purple into the magenta just like we did earlier. Add a little white. Don't worry if it's not super clean at this point. We are going to clean everything up on our final step. I'm going to add a little magenta to the tops of the tentacles, but only on the tentacles that are in front. These two here, we're going to leave those alone. I'm going to rinse and dry. Take some magenta, some yellow, and some white. Again, remember to be careful that you don't get any of your dioxazine purple mixed in. Just going to blend that a little bit so there's not such a line there. And then without rinsing our brush, we're going to get some yellow and some white. I'm going to do that twirling trick again because That will help you get uniform color if you wipe everything that's on the brush off and then mix it back in. You notice we haven't used our turquoise at all. We are getting to it, I promise. All right, we're gonna rinse and dry our brush. Make sure you dry the handle too. Sometimes what happens is there'll be water up here, and then as you start to paint, gravity will cause it to drip down, and you will get an unpleasant surprise in your painting. So now that this is a clean dry brush, I'm gonna go back and just blend away that harsh line there. I'm going to do the same thing here. Just very carefully blend. We're going to switch back to our medium round brush. Add a little more white here for the underside of that tentacle. I'm not super happy with the eye yet, so I'm just going to mix up some magenta and yellow. Notice that anytime that I'm mixing a color, I want to make sure that I use that color somewhere else so that you don't end up with areas of your octopus that don't match anything else. So I'm taking this new brighter pink that I just mixed, and I'm going to add it to the arms as well, and also to that little tubular structure. Now I'm going to make a color that's in between the yellow of the top of the eye and the pink that's at the bottom, and I'm going to use it to blend the two together. Don't worry about it if you need to make several passes at things. I do that all the time, and it's really just always kind of a work in progress. So always feel like you can adjust. I always like to think of painting as kind of a conversation, so you can go back and forth. You can try something and then decide that it didn't work. So I'm adding some more of my very lightest tone. I just want to make sure that I've got plenty of contrast. So light areas, dark areas, and medium areas. that better. Okay, so we also need to figure out what's happening in here, because you always want to make sure that your viewer is clear about what's going on. So I'm going to lighten up the front of that tentacle so that you can clearly tell the difference between this one and these two that are in the back. Now, I want to address the tentacles because you can see that they're sort of thin, so I'm going to mix up some purple and magenta and just a tiny, tiny little bit of white. I'm going to add a little bit of water to it to thin it, just a tiny amount. And I'm going to twirl my brush. See that water droplet on there? I don't know if you can see it or not, but you want to make sure you don't have any surprise water droplets. And then I'm just going to go back over all of my tentacles to make sure that my paint isn't too thin. Adding white is something that will not only lighten your color, but it will also make it more opaque. So if you're having trouble with something being thin, sometimes you can get around that by adding just a teeny bit of white. One of the reasons that I'm able to paint as quickly as I do is that I don't worry about things being messy until the very end. So I'm not super concerned if everything's not precise at this point. Now I also want to lighten this area up just a touch because I feel like we've gotten too contrasty there. All right. We don't have to let this set for a real long time, but I am going to let it dry for just a few minutes and then we will do our final step. Okay, so we've let this set for a few minutes. It is not completely dry, but it's pretty close. And you'll notice that I have added my turquoise, my last color, to my palette over here on this side of the dioxazine purple. And so what we're going to do now is clean everything up, add final details, and get this thing finished. So we're going to start with a little bit of our purple. We're going to fill in the center of the eye, and fill in that gill. And we're going to darken these tentacles that are in the back. Basically, I'm just looking for any areas that are still thin. All right. Just fix that so it's more precise. All right, so we're going to add a little bit of our magenta and some white. Add just a touch of water so this will spread smoothly. And what we're going to do is make a series of marks down each tentacle, and they're going to start out bigger toward the body and then gradually sort of taper off. And these marks that we're making are essentially where the suckers are going to go. Now this tentacle is facing us, and so there's going to be a double line instead of a single line. You don't have to worry about getting it exact. We're going to build our suckers in several layers. And the reason that we do it that way is to create dimension and depth. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but my pug is snoring in the background. It's cracking me up. All right. We're going to let that set up for a minute, and while it does, we're going to restate our lightest areas. Restating just means that we've lost something and we're going to put it back in. You can see I'm basically just going back over, blending things together. And just kind of cleaning things up. Just remember, it's a conversation. So if you do something, you don't like it, you can always go back and fix it. All right, pretty happy with that. Just continuing to blend. All right, so next We're going to make a very light pink. I'm going to add just a touch of water to it so it'll spread. And then basically wherever we put that sort of light pinkish purple line, we're going to put a pink line underneath. Just like that. And it can just taper off at the end, that's fine. All right. We're done with our round brush. We're going to go to our very smallest, and I'm going to go back and pick up some of that purple and magenta and white mixture. I'm going to make 2 lines to create the eye. Just like that. And I'm also going to go in and clean up some lines that aren't quite what I would want. Bring back the little crest on the back of his mantle. I'm going to get myself a little more yellow so that I can restate a few of my lightest lights. And just make sure everything's kind of smooth. Just like that. All right. I'm going to take a little bit of my turquoise. Probably not anywhere near that much, honestly. Some of my white. And just add a third sort of dotted line. Now on the tentacle that's coming towards you, we're going to leave our pink showing. We're just going to outline each one of those dashes that we made with our blue and create our suckers that way. Now eventually it's going to get too small to do that. And when that happens, you're just going to switch over. All right. We're also going to highlight the eye just like that. The top of the eye, the gill, just the back of the mantle. We're basically just using that turquoise to highlight. And then we're just going to get some plain white, but we're not going to rinse our brush, and that'll just keep it from being quite so overwhelming. And we're going to put the very bottom of the suckers in. So building up our layers like that makes the suckers look more 3D. Now the last thing we're going to do, rinse and dry our brush, is we're going to restate the dark of the eye. As well as sort of outline this structure. Should we get that crest? I'm just restating some of our very darkest areas. All right. You are all done. The last thing that you have to do is sign your work. So I usually on small pieces just do my initials, which is AA. And once this dries, I'm going to clear coat it. I'll show you the product that I use. It is Minwax aerosol lacquer. I use the satin for this particular type of wood. If I want the wood grain to show, I don't want it to be super shiny. Sometimes for my blue pieces I do use the gloss instead. So that's up to you. Clear coating is up to you also, but it will help your painting last. And it brings out a really nice quality if you use some kind of wood to paint on. If you used a canvas, there is a product by Liquitex that I use that's a varnish and it's a brush on. I'd be happy to chat with you about clear coating if you have any questions about it, or if that's something that you want to do, hit me up. So we are done for this tutorial. I have another one planned that's a jellyfish, so if this one does well, hopefully we'll do that. Please post pictures of your octopuses in the comments. I would love to see them, and have a wonderful day. Thanks for joining us.